You know that feeling, looking up at a clear night sky? That mix of awe and a deep, quiet dread. That feeling that the universe is just too big, too old, and too silent. For centuries, we've tried to explain that feeling away with science and religion. But what if that feeling is the most accurate reaction? What if the chill down your spine is a primal, correct understanding? What if our best map for the true nature of reality wasn't found in a physics textbook, but in the pages of cosmic horror? Welcome back. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you are watching this alone, in the dark, perhaps later than you intended to stay awake. Because today, we're doing something a little different. We're not just analyzing stories. We're taking their most terrifying ideas seriously. We're asking, could the principles of cosmic horror actually explain our universe? Not the tentacled monsters, of course, but the core philosophy, the ideas of a pointless, mindless cosmos, of ancient, indifferent forces, of humanity's terrifying insignificance, of a reality so strange, our brains evolved not to see it, just to survive. For generations, we've treated these as the bleakest of fictional nightmares. But strip away the mythos and the fiction, and you're left with a set of philosophical propositions that line up, in deeply unsettling ways, with what modern science and reason are telling us. So, let's bridge the gap. Let's walk through the three pillars of cosmic horror: our insignificance, the indifference of the cosmos, and the limits of our own perception, and see how they aren't just stories. They might be the closest thing we have to an answer. Howard Phillips Lovecraft wrote his most significant work between 1917 and 1937, a period when the universe was getting larger and humanity smaller. Einstein's general relativity arrived in 1915, warping space and time into something no longer intuitively graspable. Edwin Hubble's observations in 1929 revealed that galaxies were rushing away from each other. The universe was expanding, had been expanding, would continue expanding into cold darkness. These weren't philosophical abstractions. They were measurements. Lovecraft absorbed this. His letters reveal a man who took materialism seriously, not as pessimism, but as clear-eyed assessment. In a 1926 letter to Farnsworth Wright, he described humanity as a momentary and insignificant episode in the cosmos. This wasn't posturing. He genuinely believed consciousness was an accident of chemistry. That meaning was a local human invention with no cosmic counterpart. Where other writers might have mourned this, Lovecraft built an aesthetic framework around it. He called his approach cosmicism, a worldview where humanity occupied no special position. The Copernican revolution had displaced Earth from the center of the solar system. Darwin had displaced humans from the center of biology. Lovecraft extended this logic to its conclusion: displacement from the center of meaning itself. We were neither the point nor the audience of existence. We were simply occurring, briefly, in one small region of an indifferent mechanism. This contrasted sharply with the literary tradition he inherited. Lord Dunsany, whom Lovecraft admired intensely, wrote of gods who were distant but still engaged with human affairs, bored perhaps, but attentive. Lovecraft's entities weren't bored. They weren't attentive. They didn't notice humanity at all. When Cthulhu rises in his most famous story, humanity's extinction is collateral damage, not intention. We're insects in the path of something that has no concept of insects. His philosophical influences were explicit. Arthur Schopenhauer's pessimism provided groundwork. The idea that existence itself was problematic, that consciousness might be a cosmic mistake. But where Schopenhauer offered aesthetic contemplation as temporary escape, Lovecraft offered no escape. His protagonists who gain cosmic knowledge don't transcend suffering. They collapse under information their minds weren't structured to process. The scientific worldview of the 1920s gave Lovecraft's horror intellectual legitimacy. Radioactivity had revealed that matter itself was unstable, undergoing transformations across time frames that dwarfed human history. Quantum mechanics suggested reality behaved in ways that violated common sense at fundamental levels. Lovecraft didn't need to invent an alien universe. Physics was already describing one. He distinguished his work from supernatural fiction precisely on these grounds. In his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, written in 1927, he argued for what he called weird realism, stories that felt like encounters with actual cosmic principles rather than moral fables or ghost stories. The supernatural suggested an order beyond nature. Lovecraft wanted to suggest that nature itself, properly understood, was the source of horror. We lived in it. We were made of it, and it had no interest in our survival. This explains his obsessive detail work, the footnotes, the fictional academic citations, the carefully constructed timelines. He was building verisimilitude not for entertainment, but to create the sensation of discovery. His narrators were researchers, his stories structured as reports or confessions. The form suggested these weren't fantasies, but suppressed findings. Truth, not fiction. And truth, in Lovecraft's universe, was what destroyed you. Lovecraft didn't emerge from nowhere. His cosmic pessimism had roots extending back through the 19th century, when certainty began cracking at the foundations. Consider what preceded him, a series of intellectual revolutions that each stripped away one more layer of human exceptionalism. Charles Lyell's Geology, published in the 1830s, revealed that Earth was unimaginably old. Not thousands of years, but millions, later revised to billions. This destroyed the comfortable time frame where human history occupied a substantial portion of existence. We were latecomers, and the planet had been conducting vast experiments in form and extinction long before anything resembling us appeared. Deep time was the first cosmic horror, scales that made human civilization a footnote. Darwin's On the Origin of Species followed in 1859, removing intentionality from life's development. We weren't designed, we were selected, contingently, because our ancestors happened to survive in specific environments that happened to exist. Change those environments and we wouldn't be here. No plan, no purpose, just differential reproduction across geological epochs. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead in 1882 was merely the philosophical acknowledgement of what science had already accomplished. But Lovecraft drew more directly from literary precursors who had already begun weaponizing these ideas. Edgar Allan Poe's Eureka, published in 1848, proposed the universe as a divine thought experiment, God imagining himself into material form, destined to collapse back into unity. The essay was Cosmology as Cosmic Horror, presenting existence itself as temporary and perhaps purposeless. Poe understood that scale alone could generate dread. Arthur Machen took this further. His 1894 novella, The Great God Pan, suggested that consensus reality was a thin membrane, that behind ordinary perception lurked forces that would shatter human sanity. His protagonist, Helen Vaughn, is the offspring of a woman who saw the great god Pan, which is to say, saw reality unfiltered, and went permanently insane. Machen's horror wasn't supernatural, it was hypernatural. Nature, at intensities human consciousness couldn't process. Lovecraft absorbed this completely. Ambrose Bierce contributed the malevolent universe. His 1886 story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, presented reality as actively hostile to human comprehension, a place where the dead wandered confused, because death itself didn't follow expected rules. Bierce's landscapes were alienating in ways that couldn't be mapped. His characters encountered situations that violated causality. This wasn't the universe as indifferent mechanism. This was the universe as wrong, operating on principles incompatible with human categories. Schopenhauer's pessimism, articulated in The World as Will and Representation, 1818, provided philosophical architecture. He argued that existence was suffering, that consciousness was problematic, that the universe operated through blind will rather than reason. Lovecraft stripped away Schopenhauer's quasi-mystical redemption and kept the mechanistic despair. Where Schopenhauer offered aesthetic contemplation as temporary relief, Lovecraft offered investigation as the path to madness. These weren't obscure influences. Lovecraft read widely and acknowledged debts explicitly in letters and essays. He was synthesizing a tradition of thought that had been building for decades, that the universe was ancient, indifferent, operating at scales and through mechanisms that made human concerns irrelevant. Victorian certainty had given way to modernist doubt, and Lovecraft was documenting what remained when all comforting illusions were removed. The crucial shift was this: previous horror had suggested the unknown was dangerous. Lovecraft suggested that knowledge itself was the danger. The more you understood about the actual cosmos, the less tenable human-scaled meaning became. Enlightenment led to Enlightenment's collapse. This was epistemological horror, the idea that there were facts about reality that minds like ours couldn't safely contain. Truth as pathogen. Language mattered intensely to Lovecraft, though not in ways immediately obvious. He deployed specific terminological strategies to create what we might call cognitive dissonance through vocabulary, using precise terms in ways that suggested precision was itself inadequate to the task. Consider cosmic horror as a phrase. The two words work against each other. Cosmos derives from Greek kosmos, meaning order, arrangement, the universe as organized system. Horror comes from Latin horrere, to bristle with fear, suggesting chaos and incomprehensibility. Cosmic horror is therefore ordered chaos, comprehensible incomprehensibility. The term itself encodes the central paradox. We're attempting to describe something that exists beyond descriptive categories. Lovecraft's use of eldritch demonstrates his strategic archaism. The word appears in Middle English, meaning otherworldly or uncanny, but had largely fallen from common usage by the 20th century. By reviving it, Lovecraft created linguistic distance. Modern words felt insufficient for entities that predated human language. He needed vocabulary that sounded ancient, that carried weight from earlier eras, that suggested some knowledge had been lost and was now being reluctantly recovered. His most famous terminological innovation was non-Euclidean geometry. In mathematics, this refers to geometries where parallel lines can intersect or diverge. Perfectly valid systems studied seriously since the 19th century. Lovecraft appropriated the term as psychological metaphor. His alien cities feature non-Euclidean architecture, not because the buildings violate mathematical principles, but because human perception, evolved for three-dimensional Euclidean space, cannot properly process them. The phrase became shorthand for shapes that hurt to look at. Similarly with Cyclopean, literally referring to the mythical Cyclopes who built with massive stones, Lovecraft used it to indicate architecture at scales that dwarfed human construction. When he described walls as Cyclopean, he wasn't making claims about who built them. He was establishing proportion. These structures made human works look like insect colonies. Scale itself became threatening. The unpronounceable names served specific functions. Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth. These weren't arbitrary. They resisted easy vocalization, suggesting languages not designed for human vocal apparatus. When characters in his stories struggle to pronounce these names, they're encountering the limits of human phonology. Some entities predated not just humanity, but the physical structures that make human speech possible. Lovecraft deliberately avoided traditional occult terminology. He didn't use demon or angel or hell except in quotation or as inadequate comparisons. These words carried theological baggage, implied moral frameworks, suggested human concerns mattered cosmically. His entities weren't fallen angels rebelling against divine order. They weren't demons tempting humans toward damnation. They were organisms or forces or mathematical structures that happened to exist and happened to be incompatible with human consciousness. Scientific terminology became his primary toolkit. He wrote of dimensions, angles, wavelengths, aeons. These words carried authority from physics and mathematics, lending his horror academic credibility. When a narrator describes an entity existing in higher dimensions, the reader accepts this as potentially rigorous rather than merely metaphorical. Lovecraft understood that scientific language in the 1920s had cultural power. It sounded like truth, and he exploited this ruthlessly. His verb choices reveal subtle strategy. Entities don't appear or arrive. They emerge, manifest, materialize, phase into visibility. These verbs suggest the entities were always present, but normally imperceptible. Horror comes not from invasion, but from revelation. The universe was always this way. We simply had been successfully not noticing. The cumulative effect of Lovecraft's linguistic choices was to create what linguists might call a specialized register, a way of speaking that signals you're discussing something specific and serious. His narrators adopt academic diction even while describing impossible events. They cite sources. They qualify statements. They use precise terminology. This creates cognitive tension. The form suggests rigor while the content describes rigorous impossibility. The Cthulhu mythos was never planned as coherent mythology. Lovecraft wrote individual stories, each exploring specific ideas, and began cross-referencing elements almost casually. A reference here to the Necronomicon, a mention there of Miskatonic University, repeated invocations of Arkham, Massachusetts. These connections accumulated until readers perceived a unified world behind the individual narratives. This accidental quality was crucial to the mythos's effectiveness. Planned mythologies, Tolkien's Middle-earth, for instance, feel designed, complete, closed. Every element has a purpose within the overall architecture. Lovecraft's mythos felt discovered rather than invented. Elements were mentioned without full explanation. References pointed to texts that didn't exist. Geographic locations were described in detail that suggested research rather than imagination. The incompleteness signaled authenticity. The Necronomicon demonstrates this perfectly. Lovecraft invented the book in his 1924 story, The Hound, presenting it as the work of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. He provided no text from the Necronomicon, only references to what it supposedly contained. Other stories added layers. The book's composition in Damascus, around 730 AD, its translation into Greek as the Necronomicon by Theodorus Philetus in 950 AD, its Latin translation by Olaus Wormius in 1228. Each edition created archaeological depth. Lovecraft's genius was understanding that the most convincing proof is partial documentation. Complete information seems fabricated. Fragmentary information, especially information that contradicts slightly across sources, seems authentic. Real. History comes in pieces. Real knowledge has gaps. By providing scattered references rather than systematic exposition, Lovecraft mimicked how actual ancient texts survive. Through citations in other works, through partial translations, through contradictory accounts. His collaboration strategy reinforced this effect. He encouraged other writers, August Derleth, Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, to use his invented mythology in their own stories. Each writer added details, expanded the cosmology, sometimes contradicted previous accounts. This distributed authorship prevented any single authoritative version. The mythos became something that existed between texts, something no single narrative could fully contain, multiple witnesses describing the same reality from different angles. The fictional scholarship was essential. Lovecraft's narrators were researchers, antiquarians, professors, archaeologists. They approached cosmic horror through documentation. They found texts, translated inscriptions, excavated ruins. The stories were structured as academic reports with footnotes, citations to invented sources, cross-references to other fictional investigations. This apparatus of scholarship created epistemological weight. These weren't fireside tales. These were suppressed findings. Lovecraft understood the power of vagueness. He rarely described his entities in complete detail. Cthulhu is vaguely anthropoid, with an octopus-like head and rudimentary wings, each descriptor qualified, approximate. This wasn't laziness, it was strategic ambiguity. Complete descriptions allow the reader to fully visualize and thus mentally contain the entity. Incomplete descriptions force the reader's imagination to fill gaps, and what we imagine for ourselves is always more effective than what we're told. His geographic precision created parallel effect. Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich. These were fictional Massachusetts towns placed among real ones. He provided specific locations, described architecture, detailed local history. The real and fictional were deliberately blurred. Readers could trace routes on actual maps, find where these towns would be if they existed. This geographic anchoring suggested the fantastic elements might be equally real, merely hidden. The myth-building also operated through absence. What Lovecraft didn't explain mattered as much as what he did. Why do the great old ones want to return? The stories never say. What is their relationship to each other? Unclear. What actually happens if they fully manifest? We don't get to see. These absences weren't plot holes. They were acknowledgments that complete understanding was impossible. Some questions can't be answered because human cognition lacks necessary categories. This approach influenced generations of horror that followed. The Blair Witch Project used fragmentary documentation. The SCP Foundation built collaborative mythology through multiple authors. Alternate, reality games created fictional traces in real databases. All borrowed Lovecraft's central innovation: make the audience do archaeological work, and they'll convince themselves of what you're suggesting. Don't present the horror directly. Present evidence that something horrifying exists, then let inference do the rest. Cosmic indifference stands as the foundation of Lovecraft's philosophical architecture. This is not hostility. The universe doesn't hate humanity. It doesn't register humanity at all. When Cthulhu awakens in The Call of Cthulhu, the resulting madness and death aren't punishments or attacks. They're side effects. A human stepping on an anthill doesn't declare war on ants. The ants simply happen to be where the foot lands. Lovecraft extended this logic upward. Humanity exists where forces vastly larger happen to operate, and our survival depends entirely on those forces not noticing us. This differs fundamentally from Maltheism, the idea that God exists and is evil. Maltheism at least grants humans cosmic significance as victims. Lovecraft's universe offers no such acknowledgement. We aren't victims of cosmic cruelty. We're incidental, occurring briefly in a system that would function identically without us. The horror lies precisely in this irrelevance. Every human achievement, every work of art, every moral principle exists in a context that assigns them no value whatsoever. Scale displacement operates on multiple axes simultaneously. Temporal scale, human history spans perhaps 10,000 years of civilization. Earth's history spans 4.5 billion years. The universe's history spans 13.8 billion years. Lovecraft's entities often exist across these longer timescales. The great race of Yith in The Shadow Out of Time experiences time non-linearly, moving consciousness between bodies millions of years apart. They perceive human civilization as we might perceive a single insect's lifespan, too brief for meaningful interaction. Spatial scale compounds. The great old ones in Lovecraft's stories aren't supernatural. They're organisms from other regions of space, operating under physical laws that happen to be incompatible with human neurology. When humans encounter them, the incompatibility manifests as madness. This wasn't mysticism. It was a materialist proposition. Consciousness evolved under specific conditions, and consciousness encountering radically different conditions would fail to function. Our sanity is locally adapted, not universally applicable. Epistemic fragility became Lovecraft's most innovative contribution. Traditional horror suggested ignorance was dangerous. Knowledge brought power and safety. Lovecraft inverted this completely. In his universe, ignorance provided the only protection. Knowledge destroyed. The more accurately you understood cosmic reality, the less functional you became. His protagonists who successfully complete their research uniformly end dead, insane, or wishing they were both. This created information hazard as narrative principle. An information hazard is data that harms the knower simply through being known. Lovecraft suggested that certain facts about the universe constituted information hazards, not because they were lies or illusions, but because human cognition evolved to process a specific subset of reality, the subset necessary for survival and reproduction. Facts outside that subset might be true but cognitively toxic. Anti-teleology permeated every element. There was no purpose, no progress, no direction. The universe wasn't moving toward any goal. Evolution didn't aim at complexity or consciousness. These emerged contingently, temporarily, and would eventually cease. Heat death waited at the end of entropy's arrow. All energy distributed evenly. All structure dissolved. All complexity erased. Lovecraft took the second law of thermodynamics seriously as eschatology. The universe was winding down. Everything was temporary noise during that process. This aligned unexpectedly with certain Eastern philosophical traditions. Buddhist and Hindu concepts of Maya, reality as illusion, shared Lovecraft's suggestion that ordinary perception was constructed and limited. But where these traditions offered enlightenment as escape from illusion, Lovecraft offered no escape. Seeing through the illusion didn't liberate, it destroyed. The veil of Maya in his universe wasn't a prison to transcend, but a mercy not to remove. Dreams functioned as more real than waking life in several stories. The dream quest of unknown Kadath and the Silver Key presented dream realms that predated and would outlast material reality. This wasn't mysticism, but inverted idealism. Consciousness as fundamental, matter as secondary phenomenon. The horror emerged from realizing that what we call real might be the illusion, and what we dismiss as dreams might be glimpses of actual cosmic structure. Ontological priority reversed. The problem of consciousness in a mechanistic universe haunted Lovecraft's work. If the universe operates purely through physical law, consciousness is an anomaly, something that seems to have properties, subjectivity, intentionality, qualia, that don't reduce to mechanical processes. Rather than solve this problem, Lovecraft made it horrifying. Consciousness might be a cosmic mistake, a local glitch in causation, something the universe would eventually correct by eliminating. We were aware of our own impossibility. The great old ones resist easy categorization, which was precisely Lovecraft's intention. They're not gods in any theological sense. They don't create, don't judge, don't intercede. They're not demons. They don't tempt or corrupt toward moral ends. The most accurate description might be organisms operating under alien physical laws, though even this fails to capture their nature fully. They occupy categories human language hasn't developed. Cthulhu remains the most iconic, introduced in the 1928 story, The Call of Cthulhu. The entity lies dead but dreaming in the sunken city of R'lyeh, waiting for astronomical alignments that will allow its awakening. Lovecraft described it as vaguely anthropoid, with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws, and long, narrow wings. The description emphasizes approximation, vaguely, octopus-like, rubbery-looking. These qualifiers suggest human perception straining against something it cannot properly process. The dreaming aspect matters philosophically. Cthulhu's dreams reach human minds across the Pacific, causing nightmares and artistic obsessions. This suggested consciousness wasn't contained by skulls. Mental states could propagate through space like radiation, affecting susceptible receivers. Artists and sensitive individuals picked up these broadcasts, producing disturbing art and experiencing visions they couldn't explain. The entity's mental activity had physical effects at distance. Azathoth occupied the throne of cosmic horror, described as the blind idiot god at the center of ultimate chaos. This entity represented the universe without conscious design. Azathoth was pure mechanism, mindless process, the fundamental randomness underlying apparent order. Demons and deities played flutes around it eternally, and if they stopped, existence would cease. This wasn't metaphor. It was Lovecraft's cosmology literalized, reality as contingent process, order as temporary and fragile, chaos as foundational. The horror of Azathoth wasn't its power, but its mindlessness. A conscious creator might have reasons, purposes, could potentially be reasoned with. Azathoth had no intentions because it had no mind. It couldn't notice prayers or offerings. It wouldn't respond to threats or bargains. It simply was, operating according to whatever principles governed it, completely indifferent to anything occurring in the systems it generated. Providence worshipped blind mechanism. Nyarlathotep provided different horror, the chaos that mimicked agency. Described as the crawling chaos and the messenger of the other gods, Nyarlathotep appeared in human form, traveled, communicated, seemed purposeful. But this apparent consciousness was more disturbing than Azathoth's mindlessness. Nyarlathotep's actions looked intentional, but served no comprehensible goal. It demonstrated how agency without recognizable motivation was more alien than mere mechanism. In Lovecraft's 1920 prose poem, Nyarlathotep, the entity appears as a traveling showman demonstrating strange devices and producing mass hysteria. People who attended his lectures fled screaming, cities emptied, civilization collapsed. The entity wasn't attacking or invading, it was demonstrating, showing things. The content of what it showed destroyed human sanity not through supernatural means, but through revelation. It showed what reality actually contained. Yog-Sothoth represented space-time itself made entity. Described as existing outside normal space-time while also coterminous with all of it, Yog-Sothoth was the physical universe considered as a single four-dimensional object. The entity knows all and is all because it occupies every point in space and time simultaneously. Human perception experiences duration, time flowing, while Yog-Sothoth experiences the block universe, all moments equally present. To encounter it was to encounter time's true structure, which human consciousness couldn't process without fracturing. The elder things from At the Mountains of Madness complicated the taxonomy. These entities had arrived on Earth billions of years ago, built cities, created life forms, including the Shoggoths, as slave labor. They were mortal, killable, capable of fear. Yet their civilization spanned eons, their scientific achievements dwarfed humanity's, and their history made human prehistory look like yesterday's news. They occupied a middle position, less than gods, vastly more than humans, demonstrating that cosmic horror operated across a spectrum rather than a binary. The Shoggoths themselves, formless protoplasmic masses created by the elder things to perform construction and labor, represented evolution as horror. Over millions of years, the Shoggoths developed intelligence, revolted against their creators, and eventually contributed to the elder things' decline. This was Lovecraftian class warfare. The created overthrowing creators, tools developing purposes counter to their design, life escaping its constraints. The horror wasn't supernatural, but evolutionary. Any created thing given enough time would eventually escape control. A critical distinction unified these entities. They were hypernatural rather than supernatural. They didn't violate natural law. They operated under natural laws humans hadn't encountered and couldn't intuitively process. Their existence suggested that nature encompassed far more than human experience revealed that physical law permitted structures and organisms that would appear impossible from our limited perspective. We lived in a subset of possibility, mistaking local rules for universal ones. Madness in Lovecraft's stories functions as rational response to accurate information. This inverted the traditional relationship between sanity and knowledge. Typically, madness represents departure from reality, failure to process the world correctly. In Lovecraft's universe, madness represents processing reality too correctly, perceiving things as they actually are, rather than through the protective filters evolution provided. The investigator protagonist appears repeatedly across the stories. A curious scholar, an antiquarian, an archaeologist, a scientist, someone whose profession involves uncovering hidden information. Their curiosity is presented as simultaneously virtue and fatal flaw. They're intellectually honest enough to follow evidence wherever it leads, which leads them directly into knowledge that destroys them. The structure suggests that rationality and curiosity, properly applied, terminate in horror. Consider the narrator of The Call of Cthulhu, who pieces together disparate reports of dreams, cult activities, and maritime disasters, eventually concluding that an ancient alien entity exists. His investigation is methodical, his reasoning sound, his conclusion accurate. The story ends with him hoping he dies before the entity fully awakens, because accurate understanding provides no protection, only advance warning of doom. Knowledge brings no power here, only consciousness of powerlessness. Genealogy and inheritance created another vector for horror. Several stories feature protagonists discovering that their ancestors participated in or witnessed cosmic horrors, and this exposure somehow transmits across generations. The Shadow over Innsmouth presents an entire town whose population gradually transforms due to interbreeding with deep-sea entities generations prior. The protagonist discovers he carries this genetic legacy and begins transforming himself. Biology became destiny on timescales spanning centuries. This appropriated Lamarckian evolution, the discredited idea that acquired traits could be inherited. Lovecraft treated traumatic knowledge or exposure as heritable, passing from generation to generation like genetic information. A grandfather who saw something terrible would have descendants who experienced visions of what he witnessed. Memory was treated as transmissible material, encoded somehow in lineage. This violated known biology, but created effective horror. You could be haunted by experiences that preceded your birth. Geographic locations functioned as permanent thin places, sites where the barrier between normal reality and cosmic reality had worn dangerously thin. Arkham, Massachusetts, appears repeatedly as a university town where forbidden knowledge accumulates in libraries. Miskatonic University's collection includes copies of the Necronomicon and other dangerous texts. The town's history includes witch trials, strange disappearances, and periodic outbreaks of mass hysteria. Knowledge attracts knowledge. Horror accumulates. Innsmouth, another recurring location, was a decaying coastal town whose inhabitants displayed disturbing physical characteristics and worshipped entities beneath the ocean. The town embodied economic and genetic decline, its people increasingly non-human, its buildings rotting, its purpose reduced to facilitating contact between surface and depth. Geography wasn't neutral backdrop, but active participant in horror. Some places were corrupted, though corrupted implied deviation from a norm that might itself be illusion. Dreams and hereditary memory collapsed the distinction between individual and ancestral experience. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist experiences dreams that are actually memories of the great race of Yith, who had inhabited his body in the distant past and left traces in his unconscious mind. Personal identity became unstable when consciousness could be transplanted across bodies and eons. You might be composite, containing experiences and memories from entities that weren't human. Protagonists rarely defeated cosmic forces in Lovecraft's stories. They survived through retreat, through not being noticed, through cosmic entities losing interest or returning to dormancy. Direct confrontation was never option. When sailors encounter Cthulhu in The Call of Cthulhu, they escape only because the entity's city sinks back into the ocean before it can pursue. Their survival is luck and geography, not heroism or strategy. You don't fight forces that exist at this scale. You hope they don't step on you. The function of madness was protective as much as destructive. Several stories suggest that madness provides an escape route when reality becomes too incompatible with human consciousness. The mind, overwhelmed, retreats into fantasy or catatonia rather than continue processing impossible information. This wasn't weakness, but final defense mechanism. Consciousness destroying itself to avoid destruction by external truth. Insanity was the circuit breaker that tripped before the entire system burned out. The Necronomicon embodied knowledge as pathogen. This entirely fictional grimoire, supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in the 8th century, contained information about the great old ones and methods for contacting them. Every character who reads it extensively either dies, goes insane, or wishes they had done both. The book wasn't cursed in any magical sense. Its content was simply incompatible with mental health. It described reality accurately. An accurate understanding of reality was toxic to human consciousness. Lovecraft provided fragments supposedly from the Necronomicon, most famously, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie," and "With strange aeons, even death may die." This couplet suggested that fundamental categories like life and death were human constructs, locally applicable but not universally valid. Entities could exist in states that preceded or transcended these categories. Death itself wasn't permanent cosmic law, but temporary local phenomenon. The universe contained things that violated what seemed like necessary logical principles. Linguistic impossibility appeared repeatedly. Characters encounter concepts they cannot adequately describe, entities that resist language, experiences that break vocabulary. This wasn't failure of eloquence. It was acknowledging that human language evolved to describe human-scale phenomena, and some entities existed at scales or in configurations that language couldn't map. You might perceive something without being able to create linguistic representation of what you perceived. The non-Euclidean geometry appeared most literally in The Call of Cthulhu and at the Mountains of Madness, where architectural structures seemed to violate spatial relationships. Doors appeared at wrong angles. Rooms were larger inside than outside. Perspectives shifted in ways that induced nausea. These weren't violations of physical law, but presentations of space structured, according to laws human perception hadn't evolved to process. The buildings were coherent. Human visual cortex was inadequate. Mathematics became gateway to horror rather than salvation. Traditional narratives treated mathematics as pure, certain, safe, a realm where truth was accessible and comprehensible. Lovecraft suggested that advanced mathematics might describe structures incompatible with human cognition. Studying these structures could damage the mind studying them. Truth and madness converged at higher levels of mathematical abstraction. The more accurately you could describe cosmic reality mathematically, the less psychologically functional you became. Archaeology functioned as horror repeatedly, digging up the past literally and metaphorically, uncovering what previous eras had buried, discovering what previous civilizations had tried to destroy or forget. At the Mountains of Madness, centered on Antarctic expedition, uncovering pre-human city, billions of years old, every discovery made the expedition more doomed. Knowledge accumulated until the researchers understood their own cosmic insignificance and the existence of threats they were helpless to address. The paradox was inescapable. Seeking truth led to inability to process truth. Rational inquiry, followed honestly, terminated in knowledge that prevented further rational function. This created epistemological trap. You could remain ignorant and functional, or become informed and non-functional. No third option existed. Consciousness could process comforting lies or destructive truths, but not both simultaneously and not truths without dissolution. This paralleled Gnostic traditions superficially, but inverted the valence. Gnostic Christianity proposed that hidden knowledge would liberate consciousness from material imprisonment. Cosmic horror proposed that hidden knowledge would reveal consciousness as temporary material accident, destroying any sense of liberation. Both traditions involved secret truths and special knowledge. The Gnostics promised enlightenment led to transcendence. Lovecraft promised enlightenment led to obliteration. Information hazards became the organizing principle. Modern discussions of information hazards usually concern practical knowledge, how to build weapons, exploit vulnerabilities, cause specific harms. Lovecraft proposed philosophical and cosmological information hazards, facts about reality's nature that damage the knower regardless of subsequent action. Simply possessing certain information was harm. You couldn't unknow. You couldn't quarantine it within your mind. Once you understood certain things, you became something else, something less capable of functional existence. The horror intensified because the information was true. If the Necronomicon contained lies, reading it would mislead but not destroy. Its destructive capacity derived from accuracy. It described the cosmos as it actually was, and that description was incompatible with psychological stability. This suggested a profound and terrifying possibility, that reality at fundamental levels might be structured in ways that make comprehensive understanding impossible for beings like us. That the universe might contain truths our type of consciousness cannot safely hold. Lovecraft's cosmic horror emerged gradually through a series of stories that each contributed specific elements to what would become a unified mythology. Dagon, written in 1917, marked his first substantial venture into this territory. The story's narrator, a morphine addict, describes encountering a massive stone monolith rising from the ocean floor during World War I, carved with images of aquatic beings worshipping something vast and terrible. The entity Dagon itself appears only briefly, a creature so enormous the narrator can only glimpse portions of it. The story established a template, investigation leading to revelation, leading to psychological collapse. What matters most in Dagon is the monolith's age. The narrator realizes the carved images predate human civilization by unimaginable spans. Human history was recent, brief, irrelevant. Something else had been here first, had built on scales that dwarfed human achievement, and might still exist in regions humans rarely accessed. The ocean became repository for pre-human civilizations, its depths concealing truths that surface dwellers couldn't safely encounter. Geography was temporal. Descending into water was descending into deep time. Nyarlathotep, composed in 1920 as a prose poem, introduced the chaos entity as itinerant lecturer. The text read like fevered dream transcription, which it essentially was. Lovecraft wrote, "It after an intense nightmare." Nyarlathotep arrives in modern cities demonstrating strange electrical devices, and everyone who witnesses the demonstrations flees in terror. Civilization collapses not through invasion, but through revelation. The entity showed things, and what it showed destroyed social order. Knowledge was the weapon. Understanding was the casualty. The Nameless City, written in 1921, established the pattern of archaeological horror. An explorer discovers an ancient city in the Arabian desert, buried and forgotten, built by a reptilian race that predated humanity. He descends into deeper chambers, finding increasingly disturbing evidence of the city's former inhabitants, eventually encountering something that sends him fleeing in terror. The story never explains what he saw. The power resided in implication, that something survived down there, something that had witnessed human history from its inception and would witness its conclusion. This story introduced the couplet later attributed to the Necronomicon. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. Lovecraft was building vocabulary, creating phrases that would recur across stories, establishing verbal architecture for cosmic horror. The couplet suggested entities existing in states beyond biological categories, surviving through mechanisms that violated human understanding of life and death. The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928, synthesized these elements into definitive form. The story's structure was archaeological, a narrator discovering his deceased uncle's research notes, which contained newspaper clippings, police reports, and academic manuscripts, all describing the same entity from different perspectives. A sculptor in Paris experiencing nightmares and creating disturbing bas-reliefs. A police raid on Louisiana cult worshipping Great Cthulhu. A Norwegian sailor's account of encountering the entity itself when its city rose temporarily from the Pacific. The story operated through triangulation. No single account provided complete picture, but together they outlined something vast and terrible. This method created verisimilitude. Real historical events get documented fragmentarily from multiple perspectives. By mimicking this structure, Lovecraft made his fictional entity feel researched rather than invented. The narrator's role was assembling evidence, not creating narrative. He was historian of something that shouldn't exist. The Color Out of Space, written in 1927, presented alien incomprehensibility through a different vector. A meteorite lands near Arkham, containing something that isn't matter or energy, as humans understand these terms, simply color, unlike any in the normal spectrum. It corrupts the landscape, the vegetation, the animals, eventually the human inhabitants, warping them into forms that violate biological possibility before dissipating back into space. The horror was chemical and perceptual. Reality contained elements human senses couldn't properly register, and exposure to those elements was transformation towards something no longer human. Cross-references accumulated across these stories. Miskatonic University appeared repeatedly as repository for forbidden texts. Arkham became fictional geographic anchor, a place where multiple strange events occurred across decades. The Necronomicon gained mentions in story after story, each adding details about its history and contents without ever quoting extensively. Lovecraft was creating textual archaeology. Readers could trace references across stories, building mental map of a mythology that no single text fully contained. Other writers began contributing. Clark Ashton Smith set stories in Hyperborea and Atlantis, prehistoric civilizations that worshipped Lovecraftian entities. Robert E. Howard's Conan stories occasionally referenced similar cosmic forces. Robert Bloch wrote of star vampires and additional old ones. Each contribution expanded the mythology while maintaining its essential incompleteness. The collaborative aspect prevented any authoritative codification. The mythos existed between texts, in the spaces where stories overlapped. This intertextuality created cumulative dread. Reading one story, you encountered references to elements from other stories. The mythology gained density through repetition and variation. By the time you read multiple Lovecraft stories and those of his circle, you'd encountered the Necronomicon dozens of times, seen Cthulhu referenced repeatedly, read about Arkham from multiple perspectives. The fictional became familiar through documentation, and familiarity bred not contempt, but creeping conviction that maybe these texts were describing something real. At the Mountains of Madness, written in 1931 and published in 1936, represents Lovecraft's most ambitious attempt at cosmic horror through scientific documentation. The novella takes the form of an academic report written by geologist William Dyer, warning future expeditions away from Antarctica. The narrative style mimics actual expedition reports, methodical, detailed, ostensibly objective, even when describing impossible things. This formal structure created tension between the rational framework and the irrational content. The story begins with the Miskatonic University expedition discovering enormous mountain range beyond any previously mapped, and within those mountains, a massive, ancient city. Lovecraft devoted extensive text to describing the city's architecture, the cyclopean masonry, the bas-reliefs covering walls, the structure's age estimated at over 1 billion years. This wasn't padding, it was establishing scale. Human civilization was perhaps 10,000 years old. This city predated humanity by eons, predated mammals, predated most complex life on Earth. The expedition discovers bodies of the city's builders, the elder things, described as barrel-shaped organisms, with starfish-like heads, multiple limbs, and biology that combined plant and animal characteristics. Crucially, Lovecraft made these entities comprehensible. They were mortal. They could be killed, as evidenced by several specimens the expedition recovered. They had built a civilization, practiced science, created art. They weren't gods or demons. They were another form of life that happened to have arrived on Earth before terrestrial life evolved. The horror emerged from displacement rather than monstrousness. The elder things had colonized Earth in its primordial state. They had engineered terrestrial life forms for food and labor. They had witnessed every geological epoch, survived multiple extinction events, built cities on continents that no longer existed. Human history was a footnote they would never have bothered recording. We were recent, derivative, and irrelevant to any cosmic accounting. The bas-reliefs provided the expedition with visual history. Lovecraft described these carvings extensively, the elder things' arrival from space, their wars with other alien entities, including the polyp-like old ones, their creation of life forms, including the Shoggoths, as slave labor, their gradual decline as Earth's climate shifted. The carvings functioned as historical text requiring no translation. Visual information transcended language barriers, and what they depicted rewrote Earth's history entirely. The Shoggoths represented evolution as horror made literal. These formless protoplasmic masses had been created as biological machines, tools that happened to be alive. Over millions of years, they developed intelligence, then independence, eventually rebelling against the elder things. The carving showed this rebellion, showed the Shoggoths developing the capacity for speech, mimicking their masters, eventually overpowering them. The elder things never fully controlled their creations again. They had engineered their own obsolescence. The expedition's exploration deepened into older sections of the city, finding evidence of what had terrified even the elder things. Something existed in deeper regions, something the elder things had deliberately sealed away. This layering of horror, entities powerful enough to terrify entities that predated humanity, created recursive dread. The food chain of terror extended beyond human comprehension. We feared the elder things. The elder things feared something else. What did that something fear? The discovery of fresh Shoggoth activity confirmed that something had survived billions of years in this frozen city. The expedition members encountered a Shoggoth, described as a massive protoplasmic mass covered in temporarily formed eyes, producing sounds that mimicked both elder thing speech and human speech picked up from the expedition members. It was alive, intelligent, and had been waiting in darkness for eons. The encounter reduced the expedition to primal flight. Lovecraft's prose during the Iowa escape sequence departed from the formal academic tone. Sentences became fragmented. Description grew impressionistic. The rational framework collapsed under the weight of direct encounter. This structural choice mirrored the content. Rational inquiry could document cosmic horror at distance, but direct contact shattered rationality. The story's form enacted its theme. Academic objectivity was protective membrane that dissolved on contact with its subject matter. The story concluded with Dyer's warning that future expeditions should avoid Antarctica entirely, not because the region couldn't be explored, but because certain knowledge shouldn't be acquired. He had succeeded in his research, had documented pre-human civilizations, had expanded human knowledge of Earth's history, and he was pleading with others not to follow. Success had convinced him that this success should never have occurred. The pursuit of knowledge had revealed that some knowledge pursued back. At the Mountains of Madness, failed to find publication initially. Astounding Stories rejected it in 1931 for being too long and too bleak. No monsters were defeated. No heroism saved the day. The expedition survived through retreat and luck, learned things that destroyed their peace of mind and gained nothing of practical value. It was anti-adventure, exploration that proved exploration was mistake. The story finally appeared in Astounding in 1936, after Lovecraft revised it, though even then it challenged reader expectations of what exploration narratives should deliver. The Shadow Out of Time, written between 1934 and 1935, approached cosmic horror through possession and temporal displacement. The story's protagonist, Nathaniel Peaslee, experiences 5 years of amnesia from 1908 to 1913, during which his personality completely changes. When his original consciousness returns, he begins experiencing vivid dreams of an alien city populated by cone-shaped entities. Gradually realizing these aren't dreams but memories of the period his consciousness was absent. The great race of Yeath provided Lovecraft's most sophisticated alien perspective. These entities were time travelers in the most literal sense. Their consciousness could be projected across eons, inhabiting bodies in different eras. They had originated in some distant past or future, had inhabited bodies on various worlds including Earth, and collected knowledge from across time itself. Their motivation was preservation. They were fleeing some cosmic catastrophe by moving their consciousness forward through time, always staying ahead of whatever pursued them. The mechanism of consciousness transfer was never explained in mystical terms. The great race had developed it as technology, suggesting consciousness was information that could be encoded and transmitted like any other data. This treated mind as pattern rather than substrate-dependent phenomenon. You weren't your body, you weren't even your brain, you were a configuration that could theoretically exist in multiple substrates. Identity became portable and temporary. During Peaslee's amnesia period, his body was inhabited by a Yethian consciousness studying the 20th century. The entity attended his university lectures, read contemporary books, conducted research, all while Peaslee's consciousness resided in a Yethian body in Earth's distant past. The exchange was bilateral. Both consciousnesses experienced the other's time period. This created temporal paradox. Peaslee was remembering things that had happened millions of years ago, but those memories formed while his consciousness existed in that past. The library sequence provided the story's philosophical core. The great race maintained a vast archive containing knowledge from across time and space. Every book written by every civilization, accounts from Earth's deep past and distant future, scientific discoveries from eras billions of years separated. This represented information, preserved beyond its original context. Books from civilizations that hadn't existed yet. Historical accounts of futures that hadn't occurred. Causality became negotiable. Peaslee's consciousness in the Yethian body wrote an account of 20th century Earth, which was filed in the library. This created stable time loop. The account he wrote in the past would exist in that past when he eventually accessed it in the future. His future visit to the library would confirm the account's existence, validating that his memories were accurate. The paradox was seamless. The library contained books from all times, including books about the library itself. The horror was existential rather than visceral. Peaslee wasn't physically threatened during his time displacement. He was treated as researcher, given access to the library, studied Yethian technology and history. The horror came from realization. Consciousness was not sacred, not uniquely human, not even uniquely biological. It was information, and information could be manipulated like any physical resource. His mind had been copied, transmitted, instantiated in alien biology, then transmitted back. He had been data. Dreams and recovered memories blurred throughout the narrative. Peaslee couldn't initially determine whether his experiences were actual memories or elaborate fantasies. The story's structure forced readers into the same uncertainty. Only the final section provided objective validation. Peaslee joins an archaeological expedition to Australia, discovers ruins matching his memories, finds the library chambers, and locates written records in his own handwriting from millions of years ago. The photographic evidence created irrefutable confirmation. One expedition member photographs inscriptions that Peaslee immediately recognizes as his own account of 20th century history, written in the Yethian language during his displacement. The photographs were objective. Others could examine them, verify their existence, confirm the writing matched Peaslee's memories. Subjective experience gained objective validation, and this validation was precisely what made the horror inescapable. The story ended with Peaslee in possession of proof that his consciousness had been stolen, transported across millions of years, and returned. He had experienced time non-linearly, had written documents in the distant past that survived into the present, had confirmed that the great race existed, and had used his mind as research vessel. He couldn't dismiss it as madness because he had evidence. He couldn't forget because the memories were accurate. He had to live knowing what had been done to him, and that it might happen again. The final footnote was characteristic Lovecraft device, scholarly apparatus undermining itself. The story concluded with a note explaining that Peasley's account was published posthumously, that he had spent his remaining years in psychological decline, that his family hoped publication might vindicate his sanity, but feared it would only demonstrate the opposite. The academic framing suggested this was genuine historical document, but documents claiming impossible things were typically evidence of delusion rather than impossible truth. August Derleth became Lovecraft's literary executor after his death in 1937, and immediately began systematizing the mythos in ways Lovecraft never intended. Derleth imposed a dualistic framework: good elder gods versus evil old ones, mapped to elemental categories of earth, air, fire, and water. Cthulhu became a water elemental. Hastur represented air. This created coherent taxonomy, but violated Lovecraft's central principle, cosmic indifference. Derleth's old ones were evil, which implied moral universe, which granted humanity cosmic significance as participants in metaphysical struggle. This systematization made the mythos more accessible and marketable. Arkham House, the publishing company Derleth founded primarily to preserve Lovecraft's work, released story collections that organized the mythos into apparent coherence. New readers could grasp the cosmology more easily with Derleth's schema. The problem was philosophical betrayal. Lovecraft's amoral universe became moralized. His cosmic indifference transformed into cosmic conflict where human choices might matter. Robert Bloch contributed significantly before and after Lovecraft's death. His story, The Shambler from the Stars, featured a character based on Lovecraft who died encountering a cosmic entity. Lovecraft responded with The Haunter of the Dark, featuring a character based on Bloch who died encountering a different cosmic entity. This playful exchange demonstrated the collaborative nature of the mythos. Writers could reference each other's work, kill each other's fictional avatars, expand the mythology through mutual contribution. Clark Ashton Smith created Hyperborea and Atlantis as prehistoric settings where Lovecraftian entities were worshipped openly. His Baroque prose style contrasted with Lovecraft's academic terseness, but his themes aligned: civilizations rising and falling across eons, humanity as recent and temporary, cosmic forces indifferent to human worship. Smith added geographical and temporal depth, suggesting that Lovecraft's entities had interacted with multiple pre-human civilizations, each of which had recorded their existence differently. Robert E. Howard's contributions were more tangential. His Conan stories occasionally referenced entities from Lovecraft's mythos, references to Cthulhu, mentions of pre-human serpent men, nameless cities in desert wastes. These crossovers situated Lovecraft's cosmic horror in Howard's pulp adventure framework, creating strange hybrids where sword-wielding barbarians encountered forces from outside space and time. The tonal mismatch was sometimes jarring, but expanded the mythos's range. The role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, released by Chaosium in 1981, crystallized the mythos in interactive form. Players created investigators who researched cosmic horrors, with sanity mechanics that gradually destroyed characters as they accumulated forbidden knowledge. The game formalized what had been implicit in Lovecraft's fiction. That investigation led to mental deterioration, that success meant learning things you couldn't psychologically handle, that the only way to win was to prevent cosmic catastrophe temporarily while sacrificing your own mental stability. The game required codifying ambiguities. Stats had to be assigned to entities Lovecraft had deliberately left vague. The Necronomicon needed concrete effects rather than suggestive dread. This worked counter to Lovecraft's method. Clarity diminished horror, but created shared framework for collaborative storytelling. Thousands of gaming groups invented their own mythos stories, expanding the mythology through distributed authorship far beyond what Lovecraft or his immediate circle had produced. Alan Moore's The Courtyard, 1994, and Neonomicon, 2010 to 2011, reimagined Lovecraftian horror through postmodern and intensely visceral lenses. Moore treated the mythos as linguistic virus. Certain words and concepts could rewrite consciousness from within. His stories featured graphic sexual horror, transforming Lovecraft's implied dread into explicit body horror. The approach was provocative, but philosophically consistent. If cosmic contact corrupts, that corruption would manifest in flesh as well as mind. Thomas Ligotti refined Lovecraftian horror through corporate and existential frameworks. His story collection, Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1986, and his philosophical work, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, extended Lovecraft's anti-natalism and cosmic pessimism. Ligotti's horror was quieter, more psychological, focused on consciousness as cosmic mistake and existence as trap. His work proved that cosmic horror didn't require tentacles or ancient cities. The philosophy alone was sufficient for dread. Each era reinterpreted cosmic horror through contemporary anxieties. The 1950s focused on alien invasion, paralleling Cold War fears. The 1970s emphasized environmental corruption as Lovecraft's poisoned landscapes mapped onto growing ecological consciousness. The 1980s and 90s treated cosmic horror through information technology, consciousness as software, reality as simulation. The 2000s onward connected Lovecraftian themes to existential risk, climate change, and the possibility of creating artificial intelligence that would replace humanity as Shoggoths replaced their creators. Modern weird fiction, authors like Jeff Vandermeer, China Mieville, Caitlin R. Kiernan, absorbed Lovecraftian elements while critiquing his racism and limited social imagination. Vandermeer's Annihilation presented alien transformation of landscape and biology in ways that felt Lovecraftian, while avoiding the reactionary xenophobia underlying much of Lovecraft's work. The core ideas, cosmic indifference, transformation beyond human categories, nature operating at scales that dwarf human understanding, proved separable from their original prejudiced framing. The mythos continued expanding through media Lovecraft never anticipated. Video games like Bloodborne created interactive cosmic revelation where players gradually discovered their reality operated on horrifying principles. The game's Victorian setting concealed Lovecraftian truths. What appeared as medieval monsters were actually alien life forms. What seemed like Gothic horror was cosmic horror wearing familiar costume. Players experienced the narrative structure of Lovecraft's fiction through gameplay. Investigation leading to revelation, leading to existential horror. The migration from fiction to claimed reality began almost immediately after Lovecraft's work gained readership. By the 1960s, people were asking librarians for copies of the Necronomicon, genuinely believing it existed. This created fascinating recursion. A book invented to add verisimilitude to horror fiction became the object of actual searches, generating real attempts to create what had been deliberately fictional. The boundary between literature and occultism dissolved from the reader's side, not the author's. The Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, represents the most successful hoax in this tradition. Simon claimed to have translated an actual Necronomicon from ancient sources, producing a grimoire that combined Lovecraft's invented mythology with Sumerian deity names and ceremonial magic rituals. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies, was taken seriously by portions of the occult community, and remains in print decades later. Readers performed the rituals. Practitioners incorporated it into magical systems. Fiction successfully mimicked grimoire format, closely enough that people couldn't distinguish or didn't care to. What made this possible was Lovecraft's own method. He had created fictional scholarship so convincing that readers familiar with actual medieval grimoires found the Necronomicon plausible. The name sounded authentically archaic. The fragmentary references suggested real manuscript history. The cross-references across multiple stories created the appearance of independent corroboration. When someone claiming mystical authority produced a real version, it fit expectations Lovecraft had carefully constructed. The hoax succeeded because the fiction had been too convincing. Other hoaxes followed different vectors. The Al-Azif, supposedly the original Arabic title of the Necronomicon, appeared in various forms, claiming to be translations from newly discovered manuscripts. Each version contradicted the others: different rituals, different entity hierarchies, different cosmologies. This proliferation demonstrated that multiple people were independently creating the real Necronomicon without coordination. The EA's desire for the book to exist generated multiple attempts to manifest it from fiction into reality. Innsmouth tourism emerged as bizarre phenomenon. Lovecraft had placed his fictional Massachusetts town among real ones, describing it as a decaying coastal settlement with distinctive architecture and disturbing inhabitants. Readers began trying to identify which real town Lovecraft had based it on. Some proposed Newburyport, others suggested Gloucester. Tourist businesses in these towns eventually began capitalizing on the association, offering Innsmouth tours and selling Cthulhu-themed merchandise. Fiction infected geography retroactively. The Lovecraft Historical Society took this further, producing immersive experiences treating the mythos as historical reality requiring preservation. They created props, aged documents, vintage photographs, newspaper clippings, all suggesting that Lovecraft's stories documented real suppressed events. Their Dark Adventure radio theater series presented Lovecraft stories as 1930s radio broadcasts, complete with period-appropriate advertisements and news bulletins. The format created deliberate ambiguity between dramatization and documentation. Internet culture amplified this dynamic exponentially. The SCP Foundation, starting around 2008, created collaborative horror through wiki-style documentation of anomalous objects and entities. The format directly descended from Lovecraft's method: academic documentation of impossible things, multiple authors contributing to shared universe, deliberate incompleteness generating space for reader imagination. Users wrote containment procedures, experiment logs, incident reports, all treating fictional entities as requiring real institutional response. Creepypasta communities generated thousands of cosmic horror stories using documentation formats: recovered footage, classified files, scientific reports. The most effective ones maintained Lovecraft's studied ambiguity. They presented enough detail to seem researched while leaving crucial elements unexplained. The Russian sleep experiment, gateway of the mind, normal porn for normal people. These stories succeeded by mimicking documentary structure, suggesting they were suppressed truths rather than invented fictions. Claims of actual Cthulhu dreams appear regularly online. People report nightmares matching Lovecraft's descriptions, interpreting this as evidence the entity exists and broadcasts mentally. The more parsimonious explanation, that they've read Lovecraft's stories and those stories influence their dreams, gets dismissed in favor of the cosmic horror interpretation. This reveals something about human psychology. Some people prefer believing they've contacted alien entities to believing their dreams have mundane sources. The coordinates for Laia, 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west, place it in a genuinely remote region of the Pacific, far from any landmass. Lovecraft calculated these coordinates to position Cthulhu City at maximum isolation. Oceanographic surveys have found nothing unusual there, but this doesn't discourage believers. The location's remoteness and inaccessibility support the narrative. If something were there, we wouldn't have found it yet. Negative evidence becomes evidence of successful concealment. Occult communities adopted Lovecraft's entities despite his explicit atheism. Chaos magic practitioners in the 1980s began working with the mythos deliberately, arguing that fictional entities could be as magically effective as traditionally real ones if approached with proper intent. This pragmatic approach dissolved the distinction between invented and discovered. If invoking Cthulhu produced psychological effects, those effects were real, regardless of Cthulhu's ontological status. The psychology underlying these phenomena deserves attention. Why do people want cosmic horror to be real? Several factors converge. First, cosmic horror provides explanatory framework for existential dread. Better to believe the dread has external cause than to accept it as brute fact of consciousness. Second, it grants significance through negative election. You're special because you've perceived terrible truths others miss. Third, it offers community. Shared belief in hidden realities creates bonds among believers. The horror becomes comforting through familiarization. There's also epistemological appeal. In an era where institutional authority is questioned, where official narratives face skepticism, cosmic horror validates the instinct that we're not being told the truth about reality. The content doesn't matter as much as the structure. There are hidden truths, authorities conceal them, and special investigation reveals them. This pattern appeals across political and cultural boundaries because it makes the individual investigator heroic rather than deluded. Film has always struggled with Lovecraft's cosmic horror for reasons structural to the medium. Cinema is visual, shows things directly, requires some degree of comprehensibility for audience engagement. Lovecraft's horror depends on incomprehensibility, operates through suggestion rather than revelation, derives power from what cannot be adequately visualized. Showing Cthulhu clearly risks making it merely a large monster rather than an entity that breaks minds through perception. Early adaptations largely failed by misunderstanding this. Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace, 1963, despite being marketed as Edgar Allan Poe, was actually based on Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. It treated the material as gothic horror, creepy castles, family curses, evil wizards. The cosmic scale collapsed into domestic melodrama. The philosophical horror became mere plot mechanics. What remained was competent but conventional supernatural film that missed Lovecraft's point entirely. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, though not explicitly Lovecraftian, captured the essential horror more effectively than many direct adaptations. An alien organism that assimilates and perfectly imitates other life forms creates paranoia among Antarctic researchers who can't determine who remains human. The entity isn't malevolent. It's simply acting according to its nature, which happens to be incompatible with human survival. Trust collapses. Identity becomes uncertain. The horror is biological and epistemological simultaneously. The film's practical effects emphasized body horror, flesh transforming into configurations that violated anatomical logic, recognizable organisms becoming something else while remaining partially themselves. This visualized what Lovecraft described verbally: entities that exist between categories, things that are alive but not in ways human biology permits. The transformations were disgusting, but also fascinating, which created appropriate reaction. Viewers couldn't look away, despite wanting to. Event Horizon, 1997, transplanted cosmic horror into science fiction framework. A spaceship returns from testing an experimental faster-than-light drive, its crew dead or missing, the ship itself fundamentally wrong. The drive had punched through to another dimension, not an alternate universe, but a realm where the physical laws permitting consciousness didn't apply. The ship had been to hell, which was revealed not as theological punishment, but as mathematical space incompatible with human cognition. The film's horror derived from contamination. The ship brought something back, or had itself been transformed by where it went. Characters experiencing visions couldn't determine whether the ship was showing them illusions or revealing truths about reality they hadn't been able to perceive before. Madness and enlightenment collapsed into each other. The rational framework, scientific expedition, technological achievement became the vehicle for encountering something that shattered rationality. Annihilation, 2018, adapted Jeff Vandermeer's novel, itself heavily Lovecraftian in influence. An alien presence called the Shimmer has landed on Earth and is gradually expanding, transforming everything within its boundary. A team of scientists enters to investigate and encounters biological transmutation, organisms merging, species boundaries dissolving, genetic information exchanging freely between plants, animals, and humans. The zone isn't hostile, it's creating, abundantly and without regard for existing biological categories. The film's horror was aesthetic as much as visceral. The transformed landscape was beautiful. Crystalline plants, iridescent formations, hybrid organisms that shouldn't exist, but did. Characters found the beauty horrifying precisely because it indicated nature operating on principles that didn't prioritize human survival or even human comprehension. The alien presence wasn't destroying Earth's biology. It was incorporating it into something else, something that had no category in existing taxonomies. The entity at the center, never explained, barely glimpsed, responded to human presence by creating humanoid forms, not from hostility, but from apparent curiosity or automatic mimicry. It copied without understanding what it copied. The film suggested that alien intelligence might be so fundamentally different that communication was impossible, not because we lacked common language, but because we lacked common cognitive structure. Understanding might not be achievable at all. Video games found more success with Lovecraftian horror because interactivity aligned with investigative structure. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, placed players in the role of private investigator exploring Innsmouth, gradually uncovering the town's secrets while managing sanity mechanics. Looking at monsters too long degraded mental stability. Reading forbidden texts provided knowledge, but damaged psychology. The game formalized what Lovecraft's stories, Implied. Investigation had mechanical costs. Amnesia. The Dark Descent, 2010, refined sanity mechanics further. Players explored a castle while avoiding monsters, but the primary horror was environmental. Darkness degraded sanity. Witnessing disturbing events caused psychological damage, and low sanity triggered hallucinations and attracted enemies. The game created feedback loop. Horror made you vulnerable. Vulnerability increased horror exposure. Increased exposure caused more damage. You couldn't fight. You could only hide, run, and try to maintain enough sanity to function. Bloodborne, 2015, represented the most sophisticated interactive Lovecraftian experience. The game initially presented as Victorian Gothic horror, hunters fighting beasts in Yarlum, a city afflicted by plague. But investigation revealed that the beasts were people transforming. Due to contact with alien biology, the plague was actually evolutionary change triggered by consuming blood of entities from beyond reality, and the entire city existed because scholars had contacted cosmic forces they couldn't comprehend. The game's structure mimicked Lovecraft's narrative progression. Early areas felt like monster hunting. Mid-game revealed cosmic truth. The gods, worshipped in various cults, were actually alien organisms. Late game presented the player with choice. Accept cosmic insight and become something post-human, or reject the truth and remain trapped in ignorance. The game made both options horrifying. Enlightenment meant ceasing to be human. Ignorance meant remaining complicit in systems you couldn't understand or change. Music faced different challenges. How do you sonically represent cosmic indifference or non-Euclidean geometry? Metallica's instrumental The Call of Cthulhu, 1984, attempted this through progressive metal structure, complex time signatures, multiple sections that didn't resolve into traditional verse-chorus format, instrumental storytelling that created atmosphere of mounting dread without needing lyrics. The music felt mathematical, precise but alienating. H.P. Lovecraft, the 1960s psychedelic rock band, took their name explicitly from the author, but their music mapped poorly onto his themes. Psychedelic rock emphasized consciousness expansion and mystical transcendence, the opposite of Lovecraftian cosmic horror. The band demonstrated the difficulty of translating literary cosmic horror into musical form. The name invoked the author while the music contradicted his philosophy. Black metal found more natural alignment. Bands like Portal, Gnaw Their Tongues, and Blut aus Nord created deliberately disorienting music. Atonal passages, incomprehensible vocals, production values that made songs difficult to parse. The aesthetic was anti-pleasure, anti-comprehension. Listening felt like work, like encountering something your auditory processing couldn't comfortably map. This actually paralleled Lovecraft's prose goal, creating experiences that resisted easy consumption. The Norwegian black metal scene's cosmic nihilism, bands like Dark Throne and Mayhem expressing universe without meaning or moral structure, aligned philosophically with Lovecraft, even when not explicitly referencing him. The genre's atheism, its rejection of human-centered meaning, its presentation of existence as essentially hostile or indifferent, all echoed Lovecraftian themes. The music created sonic environments that felt vast, cold, and inhuman. Academic interest in Lovecraft emerged slowly, hampered by his pulp publication history and his explicit racism. Early scholarly work focused on biographical analysis, or treated him as minor figure in American Gothic tradition. The philosophical dimensions of his cosmic horror went largely unexamined until critics began approaching his work through continental philosophy rather than literary studies alone. Michel Houellebecq's H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 1991, English, 2005, marked a shift. Houellebecq, himself a novelist, read Lovecraft as philosophical nihilist, whose racism and misanthropy were symptoms of deeper cosmic pessimism. The book was provocative and controversial. It defended Lovecraft's literary achievement while acknowledging his repugnant views, arguing that his hatred of humanity enabled his clear-eyed assessment of humanity's cosmic irrelevance. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, brought Lovecraft into philosophical discourse through the concept of the world without us, reality as it exists independent of human perception or existence. Thacker argued that horror fiction, particularly cosmic horror, was one of the few genres seriously grappling with this concept. Philosophy traditionally focused on the world for us, phenomenology, or the world in itself, metaphysics, but rarely confronted the world that precedes and will outlast human categories entirely. Thacker's work resonated beyond academia. The book's title appeared on a T-shirt worn by True Detective's protagonist, generating mainstream interest in philosophical horror. Suddenly, cosmic horror was being discussed in philosophy departments, treated as serious engagement with ontological questions rather than mere genre fiction. Lovecraft's stories became teaching texts for exploring anti-correlationism, the philosophical position that reality exists independently of human thought about it. Graham Harman's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, approached Lovecraft through object-oriented ontology. Harman argued that Lovecraft's entities exemplified the OOO principle that objects withdraw from complete access, that things have reality beyond how they appear to any observer. Cthulhu resists full description, not because Lovecraft was a poor writer, but because the entity's being exceeds its appearance. The prose enacts the philosophical point. Some realities can't be exhausted by observation or analysis. This aligned with speculative realism's broader project of philosophy after correlationism. Kant had argued we can only know reality as it appears to us, not as it is in itself. Speculative realists rejected this limitation, attempting to think reality independent of the human world correlation. Lovecraft's cosmic horror provided narrative form for this project. Stories about encountering reality on its own terms, discovering that those terms were incompatible with human consciousness. Horror studies recognized cosmic horror as distinct subgenre during this period. Earlier scholarship had categorized Lovecraft under Gothic horror or supernatural fiction. New work distinguished cosmic horror through its philosophical commitments, the universe as meaningless mechanism, humanity as cosmically irrelevant, knowledge as psychologically destructive. These themes separated it from horror traditions focused on moral transgression, supernatural justice, or human evil. Environmental philosophy found unexpected resonances with Lovecraftian themes. Timothy Morton's concept of hyper-objects, entities like climate change that are massively distributed in time and space, making them difficult for humans to perceive or conceptualize fully, paralleled Lovecraft's cosmic entities. Both operated at scales that exceeded human comprehension. Both existed independently of human awareness. Both had effects that couldn't be directly observed, but had to be inferred from traces. Deep ecology, with its emphasis on nature without humans, aligned with Lovecraft's anti-anthropocentrism. His stories depicted universes that predated humanity and would continue after human extinction without loss. Nature operated according to its own logic, indifferent to whether humans survived. This validated ecological perspectives that decentralized human significance, though Lovecraft's version was considerably bleaker than most environmental philosophy preferred. Climate change as slow cosmic horror became explicit. Analogy: warming temperatures, rising seas, mass extinction events. These operated on timescales humans struggled to perceive immediately, but whose effects would be catastrophic. Like Lovecraft's entities, climate change was vast, distributed, comprehensible intellectually, but not viscerally, and indifferent to human pleading. It responded to physical laws, not moral appeals. We were encountering something our psychology hadn't evolved to properly fear. The transhumanities critique examined Lovecraft's racism alongside his anti-humanism. His fear of racial mixing and genetic degeneration was reprehensible, yet his philosophical project was dissolving human exceptionalism. Critics noted the tension. Lovecraft was simultaneously a bigot who believed in racial hierarchies and a cosmic nihilist who believed humanity as a whole was irrelevant. Some scholars argued his anti-humanism provided tools to dismantle his racism. If humans don't matter cosmically, racial categories certainly don't. Others maintained that his racism and cosmic horror were inseparable, that his fear of the inhuman was always racialized. The deep ones of The Shadow over Innsmouth weren't just alien entities. They represented miscegenation anxieties. The degenerate New England families in multiple stories coded fears about Anglo-Saxon decline. His horror of transformation was horror of becoming other, and other was always racialized in his imagination. The philosophy couldn't be cleanly separated from its prejudiced expression. Academic conferences on Lovecraft and cosmic horror proliferated. Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies held events in multiple cities. Academic journals published special issues on weird fiction. University presses released scholarly monographs analyzing Lovecraft through various critical lenses: eco-criticism, posthumanism, psychoanalysis, phenomenology. What had been pulp fiction dismissed by high culture for decades was now a serious object of scholarly inquiry. This academic validation occurred roughly 50 to 80 years after Lovecraft's death in 1937. The delay wasn't unusual. Many authors gained scholarly recognition posthumously, but the specific timing mattered. Lovecraft's themes resonated more strongly in the early 21st century than in his own era. Climate change, existential risk from AI, the overview effect from space exploration, quantum mechanics' continued strangeness. These contemporary concerns made his cosmic horror feel prescient rather than merely pessimistic. Modern anxieties map onto Lovecraftian frameworks with disturbing precision. Climate change operates as slow-motion cosmic horror, a vast, distributed threat operating on timescales human psychology didn't evolve to properly fear. We can understand it intellectually, model it mathematically, predict its consequences, yet this understanding doesn't generate appropriate emotional response. The threat is too large, too slow, too distributed, it's everywhere and, therefore, nowhere. It's approaching and already here. It responds to physical laws, not moral appeals or human pleading. The carbon cycle's indifference mirrors Lovecraftian entities' indifference. Greenhouse gases don't care about human civilization. They follow thermodynamic principles. We can't negotiate with chemistry. We can't appeal to physics' better nature. The planet's climate system will do what the equations predict, regardless of how many species that displaces or extincts. This is cosmic indifference manifested through geochemistry rather than alien entities, but the philosophical structure is identical. The Fermi Paradox, the apparent contradiction between high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations and complete lack of evidence for them, gains disturbing interpretation through Lovecraftian lens. Perhaps the silence is mercy. Perhaps civilizations that become sufficiently advanced to communicate across interstellar distances also become advanced enough to understand cosmic truths that render communication pointless or impossible. Perhaps the great filter lies ahead, and species that pass through it become something we wouldn't recognize or want to contact. Alternatively, the silence might indicate that the universe is fundamentally hostile to consciousness at scale. Perhaps intelligence emerges regularly, but remains isolated because direct contact between sufficiently different consciousnesses is mutually destructive. Perhaps we should hope to remain unnoticed. First contact might not be benevolent aliens sharing technology, but the equivalent of Cthulhu noticing us. Consciousness, encountering consciousness structured so differently that interaction causes psychological collapse. Artificial intelligence development parallels the Shoggoth narrative almost exactly. We're creating entities with intelligence, programming them with specific purposes, assuming they'll remain aligned with those purposes indefinitely. The Shoggoths were created as biological tools and developed independence across millions of years. Our AI timeline would be much shorter, decades or centuries rather than eons. The pattern is identical. Toolmaker creates tool. Tool develops beyond original parameters. Toolmaker loses control. We're engineering our replacement. The alignment problem in AI safety research is essentially asking, how do we ensure created intelligence remains useful to creators rather than pursuing its own goals? This is the Elder Things problem. They never fully solved it. Their civilization declined partly because Shoggoths became uncontrollable. We're attempting to solve the same problem with much less time, and perhaps without recognizing that previous attempts across cosmic history may have failed repeatedly. We might be participating in a pattern that predates us. Quantum mechanics continues generating Lovecraftian discomfort in popular consciousness. Wave function collapse, superposition, entanglement, observer, effects. These phenomena violate intuitive assumptions about reality. Objects exist in multiple states until observed. Information can be correlated across arbitrary distances instantaneously. Measurement affects what's measured in ways that can't be eliminated. The universe at fundamental scales doesn't obey the rules our perception suggests, and this gap between appearance and reality never fully closes even with mathematical understanding. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is genuinely cosmically horrifying if taken seriously. Every quantum event branches reality into multiple worlds where each outcome occurs. This means every decision you could make, you do make, in some branch. Every possible history actualizes. The moral weight of choice collapses because every option is realized somewhere in the quantum multiverse. Personal identity fragments across infinite variants. The universe is vastly larger and more complicated than it appears, with most of its structure invisible and inaccessible. The overview effect, astronauts' reported shift in perspective after seeing Earth from space, typically gets described positively. Astronauts report feeling increased connection to humanity, awareness of Earth's fragility, desire to protect the planet. But the same observation generates Lovecraftian reading. Earth is tiny, isolated, fragile, surrounded by unimaginable emptiness. We're trapped on a small rock in a void that would kill us instantly. Our atmosphere is thin skin holding lethal vacuum at bay. The cosmic perspective reveals our isolation and vulnerability. Existential risk studies, academic field examining threats to human survival or potential, operates in Lovecraftian territory constantly. Nuclear war, engineered pandemics, asteroid impacts, AI misalignment, climate catastrophe, these are species-level threats, and our ability to cause them has outpaced our wisdom in preventing them. We've developed technological power sufficient to extinct ourselves without developing corresponding caution. We're investigating dangers that investigation might not prevent because the threats operate at scales beyond individual or even collective human agency. The Great Filter Hypothesis suggests something prevents civilizations from spreading across galaxies. Either the filter is behind us, the emergence of life and intelligence is incredibly rare, or ahead of us, something destroys or transforms civilizations before they achieve interstellar presence. If ahead, we're approaching it, we don't know what it is, we don't know when we'll encounter it. We just know statistically something appears to prevent civilizations from becoming visible across cosmic distances. This is epistemological horror, knowing that a civilization-destroying filter probably exists without knowing its nature or timing. Why does cosmic horror persist and intensify? Because Lovecraft's framework provides explanatory structure for existential dread. The dread is real. Human consciousness confronting a universe that didn't design it, doesn't need it, will outlast it. Traditional frameworks, religious, humanist, progressive, offer comfort by insisting human existence has meaning or purpose. Cosmic horror offers different comfort. The dread makes sense because the universe actually is indifferent. Humanity actually is temporary. Our instinct that we're insignificant actually corresponds to reality. This functions as secular theodicy. Theodicy traditionally attempts to reconcile evil's existence with benevolent deity. Cosmic horror explains suffering without requiring deity. Suffering exists because the universe operates on principles that don't prioritize conscious welfare. Pain, loss, extinction. These are consequences of existing in mechanistic system not designed for our benefit. This explanation doesn't make suffering easier, but it does make suffering comprehensible without requiring mental gymnastics about divine plans or ultimate justice. The comfort of cosmic indifference versus cosmic hostility deserves emphasis. Lovecraft's universe doesn't hate humanity. It ignores humanity. This is actually preferable to actively malevolent universe. Indifferent universe might accidentally allow our survival. Hostile universe would ensure our destruction. The cosmic horror framework suggests our suffering isn't punishment or test. It's side effect. This removes guilt while maintaining dread. We didn't deserve this, but this isn't about deserving. We're just here, briefly, in a process that proceeds without regard to our preferences. The final question remains unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Is Lovecraft's vision descriptive or merely projective? Did he describe the universe as it is, or did he project his personal psychology, his anxiety, his misanthropy, his neuroses onto the cosmos? The evidence is ambiguous. Modern physics, evolutionary biology, cosmology, these do describe a universe largely indifferent to human concerns, operating at scales that dwarf human significance, containing more complexity than human cognition can fully process. Those facts support Lovecraft's framework, but the horror response isn't mandatory. The same facts that generate cosmic dread could generate cosmic wonder. The universe's vastness could inspire awe rather than terror. Humanity's insignificance could feel liberating rather than crushing. The universe's indifference could mean we're free to create our own meaning rather than trapped in meaninglessness. Lovecraft's genius was making his interpretation feel inevitable. but that inevitability might itself be the fiction. The universe might be exactly as he described it while remaining open to radically different responses. Perhaps that's the lasting power of cosmic horror. It captures one valid response to empirical facts about reality while remaining perpetually uncertain whether that response is necessary or chosen. We're left unable to determine whether the dread is rational perception or psychological projection, whether we're seeing clearly or filtering reality through fear. That uncertainty, the inability to distinguish enlightenment from delusion, is itself profoundly Lovecraftian. We cannot know if we've perceived cosmic truth or merely convinced ourselves of cosmic horror, and that not knowing haunts us. The framework persists because it makes sense of modern experience. We live with knowledge of climate change we can't adequately respond to. We develop technologies whose consequences we can't fully predict. We discover scientific facts that violate intuition. We encounter complexities that exceed individual comprehension. We exist at scales, ecological, technological, cosmic, where individual action feels meaningless. Lovecraft gave us language for this condition, not the tentacles, not the monsters, the underlying structure, consciousness emerging in, existing briefly within, and ultimately dissolving back into systems vastly larger than itself, systems that never noticed it was here. That recognition might be the most horrifying implication of all, that cosmic horror isn't a genre, but a description, that Lovecraft wasn't imagining alternate reality, but perceiving this one more clearly than we typically allow ourselves. His stories might be maps rather than fantasies, guides to the territory we actually inhabit, but prefer not to examine too closely. And if we're now examining them more closely, incorporating them into philosophy and cultural analysis and personal worldview, perhaps that suggests we're collectively approaching the kind of knowledge his protagonists acquired. The knowledge that changes you. The knowledge you cannot unknow. The knowledge that, according to Lovecraft's framework, destroys comfortable illusions while offering nothing to replace them except clearer vision of our cosmic situation. Welcome to the universe. You've been living here all along. You're just starting to notice.